Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
On this week's program, Governor Walz highlights his bonding proposal, House Minority Leader Kurt Daudt on the 2020 session, privacy concerns in the coming presidential primary, and the Senate's Clean Energy First proposal. Stay tuned for this week's Capitol Report. Welcome to this week's program. I'm Shannon. We begin this week with the second part of my conversation with Governor Walz. His $2 billion bonding proposal, called the Local Jobs and Projects Plan, can be broken down into 4 categories: public safety, water quality, higher education, and housing. I asked him why he is targeting these 4 areas.
The thing about housing, and this is across the state, and I think for folks to understand how this happened, it really went back to 2008 and the Great Recession. Once we saw, the greatest economic, contraction since the Great Depression, one of the things that happened was, I think logically, people quit building. Well, we didn't keep having people. We didn't keep having a population. And what we saw is we're about 50,000 units short across the state. And what that did was it put a weird twist to the market where prices went up. There was not affordable housing that was there, and we saw folks just kind of living on the edge where people are spending more than 30% of their take-home income on housing. And so we're going to make a big push around that, because it is absolutely, everywhere I go in Minnesota, it's one of the first things that comes up that people talk about. If we had more affordable housing, we'd have more stability, we'd have more people working, we could bring more people into our community. So what Minnesota Housing Finance Authority has several purposes. One of these, it works as a bank to leverage federal dollars and the help for others. We work hand in hand with the private sector. They are super supportive of the $200 million in bonds that we're putting in. And then there's about another $60 million in there to upgrade our existing public housing. And this is conversations around safety, sprinkler systems, whatever. Those will be decisions that will be made locally. That's the fundamental that starts on this. Water infrastructure projects, just the basic. We're seeing this across there, whether it's PFAS chemicals, nitrates in waters, or just simply the volume that we're seeing because of changes in climate. Detroit Lakes built their water treatment plant. Instead of predicating where you usually had a level you built it at because you wouldn't see a 500-year flood, they built it for a 1,000-year flood event, knowing that they're going to see 500-year flood events now every several years. That's just the change that's been there. And these smaller communities, because you base these things on property taxes, don't have the capacity to do it. That water treatment plant is still expensive no matter where you build it. And this idea that we can help as the state, because if Fergus Falls or Detroit Lakes does well, then so does Mankato and so does Winona. So we focused on that piece of it. Went down underneath the streets of Minneapolis, 90 feet down. There's an ingenious stormwater system down there. It, once again, is being overwhelmed. If you remember last year when we saw the heavy rains and the manhole covers popping, that's because of the hydraulic, all of the things that they take me down and show me this. That system's 100 years old. There's a tunnel under Minneapolis. Trust me, if we allow that to fail before we fix it, the cost would be catastrophic of what would happen. So we need to keep those types of things up. Higher ed speaks for itself. We have a need in this state. We have a need to start diversifying how we think about pathways to careers, how we think about technical education, how we make sure that we keep the costs down so that this burden on students isn't so much that people are choosing not to go into professions because of student loan debt. And then I think that final category of the helping around, especially communities to survive, communities to thrive, it makes sense where you used to think, a small regional trail system as just a nice to have thing, and why are we doing that? Those are things that attract young families in. Those are things that bring capacity to communities, and I think we're looking at that. And then local roads and bridges, they don't benefit from the Highway Trust Fund. We had a robust discussion about the $18 billion that Minnesota needs to keep up its roads. I was recently talking to some folks from Florida to make this comparison. Florida has about 268,000 miles of roads. We have about 272,000 miles of roads in Minnesota. Florida has 22 million people. We have about 5.7 million people. Florida has a 42.5-cent gas tax. We have a 28.5-cent gas tax. And I said that becomes numbers about how do you maintain these roads and how do you think about it. Florida also made the decision to go to tolling. So what I've said is, in that discussion, local roads and bridges and communities aren't part of that conversation. So we put a significant amount of help in there again, because if the roads work in small rural communities, that's where farm produce is moving. That's where the raw materials that are fueling General Mills and everything else comes from. And so I'm making the case that we are fiscally in a sound position. We have pushed back some of this. University of Minnesota, for example, has $7.1 billion in deferred maintenance. Communities, Minnesotans across the state submitted $5.3 billion of requests. We have the capacity to borrow up to about $4 billion. I think that's too high. I think that puts us a little bit risky, puts our AAA bond rating. But I would also say, if you go too low, it puts your bond rating at risk too, because it's the same equivalent of this. The bank loans you money on your house, you let the roof break, you let the windows, the paint peels, infrastructure, no heat in it or whatever. You go to try and get a home improvement loan, they're not going to approve it because the value of the asset is reduced. Minnesota's value is in these capital projects, and that's why I think we've struck a perfect balance with the needs, a long-term plan to start to get at this, and very fiscally responsible. And for those who say, just spend cash on this, remembering states don't run deficits like federal government does. We can leverage $180 million at a little over 1% interest and get $2 billion of projects, which equate to then about $10 billion of economic growth across the state. So I think it just makes sense. I think the business community is showing up and being supportive of this. I think local mayors are. That's where this all comes from.
One last question. You are an incredibly active governor. You regularly traverse the state with meetings, and you don't like to stay in your office.
I do not.
Apparently.
I do
so
not.
This will continue. This is how you govern.
This will continue. It's how I think it's how I taught. I think it's how I worked as a member of Congress, because it's not just about me going out and bringing my ideas. It's about me going out and listening and learning and putting, like, the difference that we did this time. It's never been done. There's never been a governor's bonding tour. Well, I went out and had these all submitted to me. That we put a rubric together to measure them and put a long-term plan of how we would tackle these things. That's a new way of doing it. I think it's a new way of governing. I think we visited, as I said, over 600 events. I think the pace will increase instead of decreasing, because I think it's really healthy. I think it gets into that one Minnesota. These communities need to see the governor there. Not that I have something amazing to tell them or whatever, but I am a person who can work with them, and they understand that the office is a catalyst to being able to work with the legislature, get things done. So you'll continue to see that pace. I would imagine I'll be in more sewers and up on more. I went up in a big bucket truck looking at how we put broadband up. I'm out at farms, I'm learning, listening, and then I think coming back here and telling the stories. And I have to be honest, sometimes they come back here and say, you know what? We were looking at this the wrong way. These folks are right, we should do this. And I think that's growth that people expect out of their elected leaders.
Governor Walz, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me. We appreciate it.
Joining me now to outline the agenda of the House Republican Caucus is the House Minority Leader Kurt Daudt. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
As of right now, the state of Minnesota finds itself in a good economic position since the last budget and economic forecast. We have a full rainy day fund and a projected surplus. How would your caucus like to handle the surplus?
Well, I think number one, it's important to know that in the last session, taxes were raised on Minnesotans by about $2 billion. And not just taxes, but kind of the worst sort of taxes you can imagine. As a public policy maker, we should look for things that protect Minnesotans. And what they passed was a provider tax, which taxes people's doctor visits and dentist visits. And what that means is that folks that access health care will be taxed more, or sick folks will pay more.
Like me.
That's just really bad public policy. So frankly, we'd like to see that be reversed. That was about a $1.8 billion tax increase on Minnesotans, and it directly raised the cost of health care for every single Minnesotan. And I think that's contrary to what everybody promised out on the campaign trail they were going to do.
So you would like to see that provider tax removed, and that would be how the surplus would be taken?
I would like to see it probably rolled back,
Okay.
because we don't have a $1.8 billion surplus right now. We have a $1.3 billion surplus. Okay. So I'd like to see it rolled back and eventually phased out completely. We don't quite have a full rainy day fund. The governor and the legislature borrowed about $500 million from reserves in the last session to balance their budget in the tails because they overspent. It's another thing that a lot of people don't know. So we need to put that, it's actually $450 million exactly, needs to go back into the rainy day fund. And then we'll be whole. So the surplus isn't as grand as it looks right now because of those reasons. There was some kind of three-card Monte at the end of session that made it look better than it was. But had they not borrowed that money, they would have spent us into a deficit. And frankly, spending was just too great in the last session.
Well, Governor Walz, Senate Republicans, and the House TFL have all stated a clear interest in a bonding bill, and this is traditionally a bonding year. So the size of the bill is probably the biggest part of the debate, and then what goes in it. Is your caucus in favor of a bonding bill? How big? What's in it?
You know, for us, you know, there will be a bonding bill. We want a reasonably sized bonding bill. We care more about what priorities it invests in. For us, that's infrastructure, so it's transportation infrastructure, water, both wastewater and drinking water infrastructure, and then HEPR and other state assets, just making sure we're taking care of our buildings at, you know, the university and other state-owned buildings. And if we can, you know, put in projects that are regionally important and Minnesotans kind of think of as regionally important or statewide important assets to invest in, those are the sorts of things we're going to look for. The biennial average for bonding has been about $1 billion for the last 6 or 8 bienniums. The governor right now is at $2 billion, so he's double the biennial average. The House right now is at $3.5 billion, so they're 3.5 times the biennial average. I think their strategy has been, let's just say yes to everybody, and then when it doesn't end up being that high, we'll blame somebody else. To me, that's politics. The reality is the bill's going to be probably larger than $1 billion, but nowhere near $2 billion. And I think members of the legislature care more about what's in it than the actual size. If it's too big, you can't get enough votes to pass it. If it's too small, you can't get enough votes to pass it. So you got to find that kind of right area.
This is an election year, and all of the legislative seats are going to be on the ballot. And according to a survey late last year by the Cook Political Report and the Kaiser Family Foundation, surveying swing Midwestern states like Minnesota, healthcare and the cost of prescription drugs is the #1 concern of voters. What would your caucus like to see done to address that need?
Well, we actually, you know, we talked about it just a minute ago here with the provider tax. That was a direct increase in the cost of healthcare for every Minnesotan, and that has a ripple effect because when providers or insurance providers are paying more to settle up your bills, that costs them more, and they have to take those expenses and spread them out over their risk pool. And what that does is it drives up the rates that people pay for health insurance. So it makes it more expensive for everyone. And those are the wrong approaches. Our caucus, specifically under my leadership, has in recent years put things in place that have actually reduced the cost of health insurance. We saw that in the private marketplace when we did the reinsurance bill, and that was a huge success. Now, I don't like putting tax dollars to, you know, to supplement the private insurance marketplace, but what we had to do was stabilize that marketplace to get rates coming down. Rates went up about 300% for Minnesotans in the private insurance marketplace under Obamacare, or as a result of Obamacare. And while yes, it did provide a few things for us, it took us from are insured from 25 years old to 26 years old on your parents' policy, and you know we already had coverage for pre-existing conditions, so it wasn't as important here as it was in other parts of the country, but it caused Minnesotans to have about a 300% increase in their premiums, and we actually took steps to lower those premiums. We think those issues are going to be just as important this election cycle. We think they were the #1 the last, and we think they'll be the #1 issues this cycle. On prescription drug costs, our friends on the other side of the aisle, the Democrats, are doing things that actually will also raise the cost of drugs in Minnesota. The insulin bill that they want to pass will actually make insulin more expensive. Yes, it'll provide it free for a few people who, by the way, can already get it at low or no cost from the manufacturers through their programs. Right. But they want to put a tax in place and a $500,000 fee on manufacturers. Those things drive up the cost of drugs and make it more expensive.
Well, you were part of the working group, and there's continued conversation on this emergency insulin piece. Is something going to be done, do you think?
You know, I think when you look at the two bills that were talked about last session, the world has kind of changed since those two bills were discussed, and we worked a lot over the interim. I was on that working group. The reality is the private marketplace has stepped up to the point where almost all Minnesotans have low or no cost coverage for insulin. Now, my caucus's priority is to make sure that every Minnesotan has access to low or no cost insulin. But the good news is the private marketplace has narrowed that down to just a very small sliver of people, what we would call the donut hole. All of the uninsured people in Minnesota, with the exception of those above 400% income, but those people can afford it on their own. But they actually still qualify through the manufacturers for a reduced copay. So no one should be paying more than $100 for insulin in the state of Minnesota. And there are still a few people that need it, and if we would focus on just those people, I think we could get this problem solved, and very easily and very bipartisan. The problem is some want to give free insulin to people who already have access to free insulin, and to me that's politics. That's, you know, this problem hasn't been solved until I have taken a vote to solve it, and I get to announce in a press conference that I have solved it. The good news is the private marketplace has already taken the majority of the steps in solving this problem.
One final question for you. The presidential primary is just around the corner, and members of both parties are expressing the need to change the law, which currently a voter's choice in ballot, whether they ask for the Republican ballot or the DFL ballot, will be recorded, and that information given to all major parties in Minnesota, and that information isn't protected. Some lawmakers are calling for a change so that can't become public information. What's your view on that?
Yeah, we haven't had really a debate about that as a group yet. I think people forget in Minnesota, because a primary for us is new. This is how they work in other states. A primary is not an election. It's not a general election. We're not electing any candidates. What we're doing is we're trying to decide how our state's delegates, through the party process, will vote and who they will support at a national convention for president, right? A primary is a part of a party process, right? Right now, we do that through caucuses, and when you go to caucuses, you sign up and they know who participated. It's the same, we're just doing it now through a primary. So they're still gonna know who participated in that party process. If Minnesotans don't want to participate in a party process, they don't have to. This isn't a general election, it's not an election, and so the parties will get the data, they should get the data. They can't really function. A primary doesn't really work if they don't get the data, because they have to use that pool of people to select their delegates for the conventions, who will then go on and support ultimately at the national convention, their nominee. So it doesn't really work without them getting that data. And I think it's just a function of Minnesotans not being used to this process and not understanding that this isn't an election, right. It's actually a party process.
Right. Minority Leader Daudt, we have to stop it there, but I want to thank you.
Sounds great, thanks so much.
The Secretary of State and a bipartisan group of lawmakers called for legislation to protect voters' privacy in the presidential primary.
In 2016, in my opinion anyway, the legislature made the right choice in moving from a caucus system to a primary system for choosing presidential nominees, opening the doors to hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans who otherwise wouldn't participate because they can't or don't have the luxury of participating in a 2 or 3 hour caucus on a cold Tuesday night. But the law does need to change. The national parties insisted in 2016 that their party rules required a closed primary that keeps track of who is a Democrat and who is a Republican. So voters on March 3rd or beforehand will have to choose a partisan ballot. Their choice of ballot will be made available to all 4 major political parties in Minnesota. That creates a backdoor party registration system, and we have never had anything like that in Minnesota. We don't register by party here. Most states do. We don't.
I've had many constituents and people across the state of Minnesota contacting me and saying that you need to change this. I will not be voting in the presidential primary if my data is available to everybody.
I'm very confident that Minnesotans across this state are going to ask all of us to understand how important it is for Minnesota Democrats and Republicans and anyone else who wants to join in selecting the nominee, that kind of participation to select arguably the most powerful leader in the world.
The average voter, at least in my district, does not know that they have to pick and it's going to go on a list and go to somewhere. And when they hear that, they go like, what? How can that be? And there's a few people, as we mentioned, that have it tattooed on their arm what party they are. But the average individual that I've run into does not. They prefer the privacy.
I represent the cities of Burnsville and Eagan, and the council and mayors of both cities have been very clear that they don't want their election administrators to have to stay home or to not vote. They want their people to be able to keep their choice of ballot secret.
The Senate Clean Energy First Act has already had its first hearing this session. Senator David Senjem is the bill's author and chair of the Senate Capital Investment Committee. I spoke with him last month about both topics and began by asking if he's optimistic about the clean energy bill's success.
Well, a bill author always has to be optimistic. There's no question about that. But then beyond that, yes, I am. I think there's the conversation. What we needed to have is a conversation. This bill was introduced at the end of the 2018 session to, if you will, let it incubate. We ran it through a committee last year, the Energy Committee. It sits in Finance now. And we continue to talk about it, not in flamboyant ways, but it's just there, and we need to think about it and talk about it. I think we all recognize it is the future. So when do we grab onto the future and ride along with it? And I think incrementally this is moving forward, and people are getting more comfortable with it.
Well, and energy policy has been an important area for you. For many years, you've traveled extensively to learn about advancements in technology, efficiency, and innovation. Will a policy like Clean Energy First put Minnesota on a sustainable path, both in terms of reliability and affordability? And how will it accomplish that?
Well, whatever we do has to be reliable and it has to be affordable. And the bill is constructed in a fashion that puts the Public Utilities Commission in the center of the target, so to speak, relative to deciding what's affordable and what's reliable. And they have guidelines within statute to guide them in those decisions. So I'm confident that being basically almost a quasi-judicial agency will do that in a proper fashion. If I wasn't confident in it, I wouldn't even have this bill. So it will be reliable. It will be affordable, in my view. And then as we move forward, what excites me about this is Minnesota is big in medical device industry. 25% of the country medical devices come out of Minnesota. I didn't know that, and I won't go into all that. But we I think if we do something like this, we can position Minnesota to be big in all of the renewable energy componentry as well. I think we can establish a new industry around this theme, and that's what really excites me. We got the climate issues and so on and so forth, but the economic issues are what really excite me in terms of this bill. Well,
and their technological advancements are on the horizon. You'd like to see Minnesota play a big role in that.
And why not? We're that kind of a state. I think whether it's medicine, whether it's medical device industry, whether it's a computer industry, basically started in Minnesota, this can happen too.
Now, increasingly, utilities have moved towards renewable energy sources on their own. There hasn't needed to be a mandate to make it happen. That seems to be on the horizon. So is this policy even necessary?
Some people question that, and I haven't even questioned that. And I've got a think tank group that I meet with every month, and we've really kind of dissected this question as well with utility people in the group, and they kind of tell me, yeah, we're moving in this direction, but we really need state government to give us that direction, to give us that roadmap. And insofar as I know, at least at this point, most utilities, they like little tweaks here and there, but I think they're comfortable with this direction. It is change. Change is always brings uncertainty and maybe a little bit of fear, but I think practically speaking, the public, by virtue of all the polling I've seen, is way out ahead in terms of wanting this kind of a direction to occur, And I think utilities recognize that, and I think the stars are falling in place.
The Walz administration is promoting plans that it does incorporate clean energy first that would make the state 100% carbon-free by 2050. In your view, is that a realistic goal?
Oh, it's all definition. What's carbon-free? If we have a natural gas backup plant to suffice, or at least to complement solar and wind energy, and that's not carbon-free. So I think it's attractive political statement if you're into it, but it's all definitional, and it will really be difficult to totally rid carbon from our environment. I mean, it's part of us, and it's part of how we live and what we use, and so, but we can clean it up a lot. And I often say we can't burn this earth up forever. The anaerobes, the microbes down that make all this gas and oil, they can't keep up to our use. And so whether it's 1,000 years from now or 10,000 years from now, this is not an infinite supply. And so from a standpoint of stewardship, let's move forward and do what we can in our generation to start this path.
Well, let's turn just a little bit, because you're also bonding chair, and there will likely be a bonding bill this session. We're talking about change, we're talking about technology, we're talking about energy production. Other sectors that significantly contribute to greenhouse gases are industry, agriculture, and transportation. Are there infrastructure needs in the state to enable the state to make this move towards more renewables, more electric car charging stations, or other ways of delivering energy? Is there infrastructure that needs to happen?
Well, no question on the electric vehicles, and a lot of people say I'd never have one, but I'm going to believe that maybe not the next car, but the car after that for most of us will be an electric car. We do need more charging stations. You may or may not know that the $70 million Volkswagen settlement suit that Minnesota has obtained, that $70 million will largely be used to install electric car chargers across Minnesota. And when that happens, it's going to, I think, even enhance the use of those kind of vehicles. And with respect to agriculture, a little difficult. It's pretty hard to pull a a 16-row cultivator with a electric tractor. Maybe someday it'll happen, but I don't think anytime soon. So you just have to work on this incrementally and let technology work for you, and that's going to take a generation or two. But I think we're heading on the right direction.
Now, finally, before you go, and we'll talk at length about this later in the session, but as bonding chair, what infrastructure projects appear to be essential to you?
Oh, it's roads and bridges. It's wastewater infrastructure. It's we call it HEAPR, funny kind of word for fixing up our colleges and universities. Those basic kind of structural kind of issues, and especially roads and bridges and wastewater, are just paramount on the list of things to do, and will be a large part of our 2020 bonding bill.
And I will look forward to talking with you more about that later. Senator David Senjem, thank you.
Always good, thank you.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Lurkey, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.